Hello, this is your first lesson for Unit 5. Lesson 5.1, the Minnesota Constitution and Governments Working Together. So it's kind of a two-part lesson. We're going to talk about the Minnesota Constitution itself. I'm going to direct you to some different activities that you do a lot more research on and really dig deep. And then I'm going to talk about how governments work together, specifically the Minnesota government and the federal government, but really, in a nutshell, all these governments work together, local governments, other states, things like that. Your learning targets for this lesson. I can explain the powers of the Minnesota government based on the state constitution. So once you're done with this lesson and the activities associated with it, you should be able to explain the powers that the government has here in Minnesota. And I can explain how the state government works with the federal government. So, Minnesota's Constitution, just like the federal Constitution, it is the law of the land. You know, we have to follow this Constitution and the laws in it. Now, there are some differences. We adopted the Minnesota Constitution on October 13th, 1857. Which leads us to the conclusion that there's going to be some changes. People are going to understand how to run a government more efficiently than they did when they ratified the federal Constitution. As you probably know from the whole, Articles of Confederation and Constitution debacle from a previous unit. So there's some differences because as we grow as a nation, we learn and become better, just like as you do as you learn and grow. We have 14 different articles in the Constitution. That's compared to 7 in the federal Constitution. So again, a lot more specifics. There's different things about conservation, a lot more specifics about taxation. There's an article that just focuses on the environment. So the similarities and differences, we still have, articles talking about the judicial branch, which has to deal with, courts and things like that, if you remember from your previous units. The executive branch, which is the area where the governor comes from, and lieutenant governor, which can connect or be attributed to and are similar to the president and the vice president of the United States. Really the same idea there. And then we have the legislative branch. The legislative branch is the branch that makes the laws. Just like the federal government, we have senators and we have representatives. Now, that's where things start to change a little bit, and we do see some differences. As you know, for the federal government, you have 100 senators, one for each state, the 50 states, or 2 for each state. And we have representatives based on the population. Well, Minnesota doesn't quite work that way because there are many senators and many representatives. The ratio is not the same. And it changes constantly, just depending on the population of the state. The powers of Minnesota's government. Taxation. We do have taxation here in Minnesota. The state does have the power to tax you or your parents or an older person that you trust could tell you all about the state tax. You've probably paid sales tax before. That's generally a state tax. But there's also income tax that the state collects, and we'll go into that in a different lesson later. War. Minnesota cannot declare war. The federal government does have the power to do that, more specifically Congress. We cannot do that in Minnesota. We cannot raise an army. That's not a power that the Minnesota government has. We just don't have that power here. That's where you get this idea of the republic and having the federal government kind of overseeing everything and the states underneath. Borrowing. The state can borrow money, and as you've probably heard in the news, most states are actually in debt, including Minnesota, and we're going to talk about the debt. But the state has the power to borrow money to pay for the services that you and I and other Minnesotans use. Gambling. There are some very specific sections on gambling in our Constitution, talking about the lottery, and you've probably heard of the Minnesota State Lottery. Also talking about racetracks and horse racing. You've probably heard of Canterbury Downs. Those are things that are specifically put into the Constitution. This one's always interesting to me, the environmental powers. If you read through the Constitution of the United States, you don't really see anything specific to the environment. We don't really, there's nothing about national parks or anything like that. Well, Minnesota's different that way. Because, I think as a Minnesotan, we really think about, the environment and conservation and state parks and things like that. Well, things like that are in the Constitution itself, and the conservation and the ability of the government to designate an area of land for safety and for conservation, for that area to not be touched by businesses and corporations and things like that. And laws. And of course, just like the legislative branch of the federal government creates laws, so does the legislative branch of Minnesota. We create laws, and then of course the governor has to sign that law, or they can veto, and then it goes in the 2/3 majority vote with the two parts of the legislative branch, the House and the Senate, just like it does in the federal government. Here's a picture of the Boundary Waters area, which is protected by our Minnesota Constitution. The state government and the federal government does work together. They have separate things, but they also do a lot of the same things. Their goal is really the same. It's to provide services for the people to run the country better. I like to think about it like a franchise restaurant. There's a lot of Applebee's around the United States and Canada probably, I guess I'm not sure. But they're not all ran completely the same, but they have the same set of rules. Well, the federal government's kind of like the person saying, hey, these are the rules, but then the manager of that specific store might be like a state government and say, okay, we're going to do things this way, and we're going to spend money this way, and they might, do things a little bit differently, but they still have the same goal in mind. Okay, so for your next steps, you're going to go ahead and do activity 5.1 and 5.2 to dig deeper on these subjects. 5.1, you're going to be doing more research on the Constitution itself, and there's links to get to the Constitution of Minnesota. And in activity 5.2, you're really going to be comparing and contrasting the federal government with the Minnesota government.